So we're still stuck on the 10th step. Now, anybody have any questions or comments before we beat this horse? So the fact that I have so many slides on the 10th step, I think, does give an indication of the importance of it. And there's a whole lot of what's alluded to in the 8th or the 9th step that manifests in the 10th step on a regular basis. So it all ties together. Our first objective will be the development of self-restraint. The line is practice restraint of pen and tongue. This carries a top priority rating. When we speak or act hastily or rashly, the ability to be fair-minded and tolerant evaporates on the spot. Boy, we haven't seen that in politics lately, have we? One unkind tirade or one willful snap judgment can ruin our relation with another person for a whole day or a whole year. Nothing pays off like restraint of pen and tongue. We must avoid quick-tempered criticism and furious, power-driven argument. The same goes for sulking or silent scorn. These are emotional booby traps baited with pride and vengefulness. Our first job is to sidestep the traps. When we are tempted by the bait, we should train ourselves to step back and think, for we can neither think nor act to good purpose until the habit of self-restraint has become automatic. That's not a good idea for about anybody, right? You know, count to 10. You know, mothers have been telling their kids this for thousands of years, you know, and it's true. And how many people know addicts that are inclined to come in and bowl over whomever it is and explain why it makes sense that they're so hurt or so angry or so self-righteous? And it continues, and it continues, and it continues. So I just think this is really nicely put out. What people in recovery are needing to work on to be able to live in a way that they're no longer inclined to revert back to using alcohol and drugs to get okay. And that's sort of key to what we're doing. The alcohol and the drugs that people were using were maladaptive coping mechanisms. And that simply means they worked to a point. They sort of worked. They worked for a while, then they stopped working, the maladaptive coping mechanisms. And so they put down the maladaptive coping mechanisms, and everything that we're talking about has to do with the development of adaptive coping mechanisms, of the way to be centered and balanced, of the way to be okay and at peace with themselves without being all self-medicated. The 11th step. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. So I have a little note here. This step gives the therapist the door to help clients learn to live in the present via meditation, MBSR, and other techniques. So a lot of people get a lot of benefit out of praying. Some people don't. There's some people that have religious beliefs that get into recovery. Many people don't. There's many people that once they get into recovery, they reconnect with their religion. I was at a play up at Cornell that was put on by, is it Hillel? Hillel, which is, it was a group that is based in a Jewish rehab in LA. It was awesome. And they were comparing Seder with an AA meeting. It was very powerful, an AA meeting. And it was great. It was very powerful. And this rehab is populated by everybody that shows up there is feeling like ex-Jews. You know, I had it shoved down, it's like all the Catholics, and I had it shoved down my throat, and I hate this and I hate that. And now they don't any longer. And, you know, it was pretty cool. So I know a guy once, he told me the story about he was in rehab. And he was talking to the night counselor. And the night counselor in rehabs are like the low person on the totem pole. And, you know, the shortest time period, the least credentials, and this and that. And he was talking to the guy. And the night counselor asked him, he said, There's two different things here in this story. And the first one was, do you have a higher power? And the guy said, well, I don't know. And the guy said, well, if you did have a higher power, would he forgive you for what you've done? And the guy thought about it for a minute, and he said, yeah, probably. And then that night counselor said, well, then who are you to not forgive yourself? It's a very interesting concept. The guy was putting himself above the God he didn't believe in. God would forgive me, but I can't forgive myself. Very important concept. It was totally lost until that night counselor pointed out. Then the guy said, do you pray? And then the guy said, no, I don't pray. And he said, well, pray even if you don't mean it. And the guy said, oh, I can do that. And what came out of that was the guy developed the awareness that his praying led him to stop living life like he were God. Now, I'm not talking about in the psychotic sense where you're having delusional thoughts, but just in the sense of people living in the I have to fix this. This was my fault. I'm never going to be okay. I can't do this. And that guy started doing this prayer he didn't believe in, and he got peace from it because it took the burden of the world off his shoulders, and he became just another bozo on the bus. And it opened him up to further change happening. But so the prayer idea can be helpful even if a person doesn't have any concept of any particular God or higher power. The conversations about God and higher power can be quite humorous in open AA meetings, closed AA meetings too, I'm sure, where people will talk about having a tree or a doorknob or their sponsor or their group or whatever is their higher power. But I think at a minimum what it does is it helps people let go of that I thing. I heard a guy say once, he said, I can either be God or I can be happy. I am not good enough at being God to both be God and be happy. And I think that that's a very helpful concept. Now my particular part about this that I like is the meditation piece. I think it's pretty cool that they threw that concept in there back in the 30s, because I don't think it was talked about as much back then as is now in Ithaca. I don't know if it's really talked about anywhere other than Ithaca, but it probably is. Present, aware, not driven by fear, the three things that I claim to work on. And somebody asked, well, how do you do this? Well, one of the ways to do it is to become competent at practicing to be present. So I have those three things down there, and a thing called mindful breathing. Has anybody ever done mindful breathing? It's a type of meditation you can do anytime, any place, eyes open. You can do it while you're driving, you can do it while you're at work, you can do it in mid-argument as long as it's the other person's turn to yell. And mindful breathing is an excellent way to come back to the here and now, cognitively and emotionally. So I'm about to teach all of you how to do mindful breathing. I will guarantee you it will not help you if you don't do it. If you do it, there's a very high probability that it will help you be more relaxed and enjoy life more. It'll also do a few other things for you in a positive vein, but I'll get to that towards the end. So, does anyone in this room ever argue with people that aren't there? Yeah, that's why I asked that question. Most people relate to that. Most people have a tendency to either finish the fight they just left while they're driving to work, or they're practicing the fight they're going to have with the spouse when they get home, and they generally have no idea they're doing it. I'll ask people, I said, how long did you drive to work? I say 20 minutes. How much do you remember? Oh, none. And they're having a difficult day. It's 7:30 in the morning, but for them it's 3 in the afternoon at the meeting they have with their boss, and they're explaining to the boss what a jerk they are. So they're pumping their adrenaline, their endorphins, and their cortisol, kicking in the fight or flight response, and nothing is going on except for up in here, and they have no idea that it's happening. They're not present. They're not aware of what's going on, and they're being driven by fear. So I'm going to teach you this mindful breathing. I'm going to give you 4 words to write down. Write them down. I swiped these 4 words from a Vietnamese Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, although they aren't actually the right words, so don't tell them. Calming, C-A-L-M-I-N-G. Smiling, peaceful, and wonderful. 4 words representing 2 cycles of breath. When you find yourself arguing with a person that isn't there, and there's any number of other times when you're not present, but this is the example. When you find yourself arguing with a person that's not there, the first thing I want you to do is make a mental note. How long was I in that argument before I noticed? How long was I obsessing before I became aware of it? How long was I ruminating before I became aware of it? How long was I projecting before I noticed I was projecting? And then you make a mental note. I was arguing with my husband for 20 minutes before I noticed. And then all I want you to do is breathe. I want you to inhale, and I want you to notice the beginning of your in-breath, the middle of your in-breath, and the end of your in-breath. And on your in-breath, say to yourself, calming. Your eyes stay open, especially if you're driving. And then I want you to exhale and notice the beginning of your out-breath, the middle of your out-breath, and the end of your out-breath. Smiling. Inhale peaceful, exhale wonderful. 2 cycles of breath, 4 words, and repeat. When you start the mindful breathing, start it with the intention of repeating those 2 cycles of breath, the 4 words, a few times. Maybe at the beginning, the first few days or a couple of weeks you're doing this, you might need to do it if you're really stressed. You got a flat tire, you're late for work, and a very important meeting you're missing. You might need to do it like 10 times. You might need to do it all the way to work. Calming, smiling, peaceful, wonderful, and repeat. What's likely to happen is you'll do calming, smiling, peaceful, wonderful once or twice, and then you'll realize you've been gone for another 10 minutes back in the argument. And you'll go, damn, Jeep said that was going to happen, but I was really focused. I was really trying to do this. Don't worry about it. When you notice that you're back in the argument or you've gone on to another one, just say to yourself in your mind's ear, thinking or arguing, and start following your breath again. And keep doing that until you relax, until you show back up where your feet are, until the negative feelings that you accumulated during that obsessive little trip, until they dissipate. And that may be a few times at the beginning. Now, I have another interesting thing that I want you to do, because I want you to do this mindful breathing, and I want you to do it whenever you're arguing with people, or whenever you simply realize that you're living in the wreckage of the future. Now, addicts are really good at living at the wreckage of the future. Some specialize in the wreckage of the past. Some mix it up nicely, but they're seldom present. So whenever you notice that you're arguing with people, you're in the wreckage of the future, I'm never going to be okay. I'm not going to have any money when I retire. You're 25, I'm not going to, you can worry about it for the next 40 years, but I don't recommend it. So the mindful breathing will help you relax. But I want you doing the mindful breathing, on average, 20 or 30 times a day. Some of you people will be 40 or 50 times a day people. 1 or 2 of you will be more. And what's going to happen? Why do I want you doing this? Because what you're going to find is when you start paying attention to how often you wander off and are arguing with people that either don't exist or are long dead, or you haven't seen for a couple hours, you're going to find that you are gone more than you're present. Most of us, the only time we show up is when we're concentrating on our work, or we're concentrating on our kids, or we're doing something else. Most of us are in la-la land a lot of the time. A lot of us are in la-la land with negative emotions attached to it. If you're having a great future, stay there. But if you're not, come back. Because the suffering that we're doing doesn't actually have to do with our life. The suffering we're doing has to do with the story of our life. And the story of my life is, I'm never going to be okay. And it may be because of the wife or the kid or the job or the climate. I'm never going to be okay. So Do the mindful breathing every time you find yourself experiencing negative feelings that are attached to something other than the present. And what's going to happen is your bias is going to change. Most of us are biased towards not being present. And if you do this mindful breathing 20 or 30 times a day for a few weeks, a few months, your bias will start to change. And over time, you will end up biased towards being present. As you become biased towards being present, you will experience much less suffering. You will experience less anger, less resentment, less guilt, less shame, less anxiety, less stress, because most of your anxiety is fear of the future. I mean, by definition, it doesn't have to do with what's going on now, but how many of us are treating clients for anxiety? And, we don't know how to help them come to find out, you're actually okay right now. This is a good tool for them. Oh, I'm okay right now. This thing that is making me crazy has to do with tomorrow or next week. So I am not advocating that we train people to have better stories. You're going to do better on your exam than you think. That's not what I'm saying. I only want you worrying about your exam while you're taking your damn exam. Don't worry about your exam today. Easier said than done. Mindful breathing. Now, these 4 words, properly done, they're 4 phrases. It's inhaling, I'm aware that I'm inhaling. Exhaling, I'm calm. Inhaling, I'm aware that I'm inhaling. Exhaling, I'm smiling, and etc. Most people don't breathe that deeply, so I stick with the words. And some people don't like the words, and that's very understandable. It can work just as well by counting 1 to 20. 1 on the in-breath, 2 on the out-breath, 3 on the in-breath, 4 on the out-breath. If the last number you remember is 5 before you realize you're in Boston arguing with a cab driver, just say thinking or arguing in your head, start following your breath, starting over at 1 until you can get all the way through to 20 without wandering away. Or stop as soon as you realize that you're where your feet are and that you're okay, rather than you need to finish this argument with this guy you saw 2 years ago. So that's a type of meditation. I recommend strongly for people to become competent at meditation. Now, one of the things about alcohol and drugs, I've said it before today, is they get rid of the future and the past. You know, I go to my little bar in the kitchen or in the basement or whatever, and just walking down the steps, I'm good. That is a huge loss to no longer be able to experience that feeling of okayness. If you meditate, and if you practice meditation, doing meditation once a year is not terribly helpful. But if you develop the habit, the tendency, sort of like the habit of going to the gym or the habit of running, if you develop this habit, what's going to happen is yesterday's stresses are going to dissipate. What's going to happen is tomorrow's stresses won't overwhelm you today. And so you get to experience that I'm okay feeling by doing something that is free and safe, and you can do it every day. You'll get different experiences. I'll tell you another story. This is my 10-quart container story. You're getting quite a value for your buck here today. The way I think about it is emotionally, we're all 10-quart containers. Our capacity for feelings is 10 quarts. The problem is that most of us wake up every day 9.5 quarts full. So we only have this much freeboard. So the guy that cuts us off in traffic, the insult from the sideway crack from the coworker, we're overflowing. We're overflowing by 9 o'clock or by 7:30. And doing the mindful breathing that I just taught you, that will help you fill up more slowly. Becoming competent at being able to tell the difference of when you're present and when you're projecting, when you're planning, when you're projecting, when you're working versus worrying. Becoming competent at telling the difference and letting go of the worry, letting go of the projections, letting go of the obsessing, letting go of the ruminating. That helps you fill up more slowly. It makes life go better for you, and it makes it go better for the people around you. Doing a sitting meditation, and there are a lot of people in town that are teaching sitting meditation. I do it for my clients, but I don't sort of do it as a separate thing. But you can learn it. Doing that sitting meditation for a period of time each day is like opening a stopcock or a valve at the bottom of that 10-quart container and letting the old feelings drain out. That thing that happened to me when I was 10, the thing that I did when I was 18 that I feel really bad about, the thing from yesterday and last week that's bad, it dissipates. And after you've done a sitting meditation or meditations, I'm not selling any particular brand, as you do that regularly or habitually, you start waking up 3 or 4 quarts full. When you're waking up 3 or 4 quarts full, you then have this much freeboard. You have the capacity then for today's stressors to come in without overwhelming you. So somebody's a jerk, some's difficult, the car breaks down, the bill that you thought got paid that didn't get paid, and now the collection, you've got the room to handle it. So your ability to do life without becoming overwhelmed, being skillful, you can actually, unfortunately, you can take on a lot more tasks without it being overwhelming because you have the resources, the emotional resources, and the ability to concentrate to make it possible because you've dissipated the negative energy. And the way I think about how this works, excuse me, when you remember an old relationship, and the guy, the gal was really abusive, and every time you've thought about it, it really has put you over the edge. When that memory comes into your mind in the course of the day, not necessarily in a therapist's office, it just comes into your mind, this painful thing comes into your mind. It comes in on the 1 to 10 scale, it comes in as a 10, and it goes out as a 10. As a matter of fact, it may come in an 8 and go out as a 10, depending on what miracle grow we put on it. But as you're meditating, these experiences, these awarenesses, these thoughts, these feelings, they'll come in at a 9 or a 10, and they'll go out as a 7 or an 8. And the next time they'll come in as a 7 or an 8, and they'll go out as a 5 or a 6 or a 4 or a 5. And eventually, they're 3s or 4s, and they're simply a memory. They're no longer a problem. So we're not trying to work to more successfully repress, suppress, or deny our life experience. We're really just depotentiating. We're taking the negative energy out of it. So we're no longer suffering the consequences of things that either happened to us or that we did. And it's very freeing. Now, from an addiction standpoint and a recovery standpoint, this once again cuts down the need to relapse or the inclination to relapse because we're not getting triggered by, we see a movie or a TV show or a news report and all of a sudden we're back in this thing that happened to us, and it really puts us over the edge, consciously or unconsciously, and quite often it's unconsciously. So that meditation thing can be quite helpful. Thoughts, questions, concerns? Yeah.
When would you say it's a useful tool in the recovery process? Somebody's still in active addiction, if they're going through withdrawal, like on their own, if they're not in an inpatient setting. When is it appropriate to start talking about meditation with their clients?
I start when they're still using, for sure. Meditation while you're detoxing can be really helpful. Meditation while you've got the DTs, although it can be quite confusing, can be very helpful. So yeah, right from the get-go. One of the problems with detoxing is you feel terrible and you're in this, it's going to be like this forever, I can't live through this, or I know a way to feel better and that way will work. all of those are stories. And doing the meditation can help you let go of all of those stories, good and bad. And that can be helpful as you get through the crisis part. But yeah, I just assume people were doing, a lot of people when they're detoxing, they can't sleep. Doing any type of meditation when you can't sleep, many of my clients have learned how to do the mindful breathing when they can't sleep. In minimum, what will happen is you'll relax and you'll fall asleep. A serious meditation instructor would get very stressed that I'm encouraging people to meditate to fall asleep, but that's okay. So yeah, it can be very helpful, even when you're still using. What else? Oh, the 11th step prayer. Now, once again, this isn't exactly my language, but I love the sentiments. I think this is, and matter of fact, Bill Wilson, this prayer is in the 12 and 12. So in AA they call it the 11th step prayer, and it's St. Francis' prayer. And I think the sentiment is wonderful for all of us, and I think it's particularly helpful for addicts who often have a tendency to be selfish and self-centered. Usually driven by fear, but that's, Lord, make me a channel of thy peace, that where there is hatred, I may bring love, that where there is wrong, I may bring the spirit of forgiveness, that where there is discord, I may bring harmony, that where there is error, I may bring truth, that where there is doubt, I may bring faith, that where there is despair, I may bring hope, that where there are shadows, I may bring light, that where there is sadness, I may bring joy. Lord, grant that I may seek to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, to love than to be loved. For it is by self-forgetting that one finds. It is by forgiving that one is forgiven. It is by dying that one awakens to eternal life. Now, I think it's pretty awesome. I'm not quite so sure about the eternal life one way or the other, but I'm okay with that because I don't need to know. But I do know that these sentiments are very helpful for helping people live in such a way that they feel good about themselves. And one of the biggest characteristics of an active addict is they don't feel good about themselves. And a lot of people, when they become abstinent, continue to not feel good about themselves. So this is a very helpful reminder for people. It's like, oh, if I do this stuff, things are going to work better. And that really is very helpful for people in general and for addicts in particular. Yeah?
I think what's wonderful about this is that it does get somebody out of the I need, I
Mm-hmm.
want, I should have. And I think that's kind of one of the bases of AA. When you can help others.
It is the founding
are on the
basis.
road to
Yeah.
forever recovery.
Yeah.
Once you cross that line. So I think this is, yeah, I agree with it. Okay, it's a prayer, we can't all relate to the Lord, but the ideas are fantastic
Yeah.
to put yourself, climb over yourself somehow.
Yeah.
Do something else.
Yeah, I think you're right. It certainly isn't going to hurt anybody. When you raised the question before about when to start meditation, a lot of people in the 12-step environment say the Serenity Prayer. In Ithaca, they usually start and end their AA meetings with the Serenity Prayer. In other towns, and other cities, and other states, they'll often end the 12-step meetings with the Our Father, which a lot of people have problems with. People in general, women in particular, will have, it's pretty patriarchal. There's a lot of stuff in the AA language that is parochial and sexist. And a lot of people have to work to get over that. But the Serenity Prayer, it's God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, when you say that repeatedly, it's a meditation. It's like saying the rosary. When people say the rosary, they're quite often not exactly thinking about the meaning of every word as they're doing. They're meditating. And meditation is, and with the Serenity Prayer, God grant me the way it's delineated or dissected is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. That's everybody else. The courage to change the things I can. That's me. And the wisdom to know the difference. What's their stuff and what's my stuff. It's a very handy little meditation and instruction guide for people to get back to center and go, what, if anything, do I need to do? And so that just seemed appropriate to throw in. Yeah, Tommy.
I love the language and appreciate it. For me, one of the challenges with folks I work with is they're more apt to forgive others than themselves. That become one of the challenges.
Yeah. Tommy just mentioned that for a lot of people it's easier to forgive others than themselves. That is absolutely true. And guilt and shame kills people. And it kills a lot of people. As a matter of fact, I have a book on my shelf called Guilt, Shame, and Alcoholism. And one of the reasons that we want to work with people with love and compassion is because it's effective. And another is because one of the things going on is you're dealing with people that have a lot in guilt and shame, whether they are able to show that to you or not. And so what we can do to help them raise out of that inferiority thing, we meant self-centered fear, egomania with an inferiority complex, and isolation. So yeah, you're right on the money with that. I had another little footnote. One of the things that's been going on today is we're actually working off 2 sets of notes. This is these overheads. The PowerPoints are not the ones that I brought with me today, because the ones I brought with me today, the computer wouldn't talk to, which is okay. Say what?
You're winging it.
It's sort of like life, you know. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to other alcoholics, addicts, and to practice these principles in all our affairs. That's the 12th step, and it was just pointed out. That middle part, carrying the message to other fill in the blank, alcoholics, drug addicts, food addicts, sex addicts, whatever. That is what the mental health people regard as an altruistic defense. An altruistic defense is one of the few healthy defenses. Punching someone is a defense. You know, yelling, you know, is a defense. Getting angry can be a defense. An altruistic defense is when you're doing something for someone else for no obvious benefit for yourself. The key word there is obvious. And the foundation of AA is exactly that. When Bill Wilson was in that hotel lobby in Akron, he had the awareness, if I don't find someone to help, I'm going to drink again. And so what he was doing when he went and found Dr. Bob was helping himself. The helping of Dr. Bob, it turns out, was secondary. Now, it works out really well. It worked out really well for Dr. Bob and a whole bunch of other people after that. But the original awareness was, I need to find somebody to be helpful to. And that is the foundation of all the 12-step stuff, is an altruistic defense. And you know, we're on the 11th step. You know, it came into that. The St. Francis prayer, I think, is awesome that way, because it basically says, you know, with everything, is, you know, try and understand, right? You know, don't, you know, oh God, if you only understood, you'd realize that if you had my life, you'd drink too. It's like, ah. Yeah, you know, and so we're letting go of that. Spiritual awakening. Well, what the heck's that about? Now, a lot of you know, trained professionals, a lot of the scientific basis, you know, we're not so sure about the spirit. You know, now we're doing functional MRIs so we can see what's happening to the brain. So I'm not so sure about the spirit. I think it's a very helpful concept, is the spirit. I was talking with somebody at lunch and talking about grace, because this whole recovery thing and the therapy that we do in our office it's not science. You know, and there's a whole lot, it's not math, it's not calculus, it's not, you know, if I go to, you know, see my therapist for 3 years, and you know, I go to 1,000 AA meetings, and I do the steps with my sponsor. As a matter of fact, I do 3, 4, and 5th steps, and I go to the jail and the hospital and Dick Van Dyke, you know, every once a month for 10 years, I'm going to be sober. Some people, yeah, and they have an awesome life. Other people, nothing changes. So there is a certain secret sauce, a certain je ne sais quoi, a certain thing that happens for some people and it doesn't happen for others. And it does seem that for some people it happens and then it goes away. And one of the things that this is very common is people go into a 12-step program because they had the car wreck or they lost the relationship or the job or whatever. There's something that they call a bottom. And as a footnote to that concept of a bottom, I regard a bottom as having something happen that causes your defenses to fail. Most people that are abusing substances are able to rationalize and repress and suppress and deny amazing amounts of stuff to tell the story of why it makes sense for them to continue using. So a bottom is when that doesn't work for a while. When it doesn't work for a while, my experience is you have about 24 or 48 hours when they're still teachable. And after that, they generally have their defenses back up and the odds of really being helpful at that time diminish greatly. What we're doing with the spiritual awakening concept is encouraging people to stack the deck in a way that leads to the highest probability of recovery and ongoing recovery. And with the sense and the awareness, there is no guarantee that if you do X, Y, or Z a certain number of times, you're going to get to where you want to go and stay there forever. But you can increase the odds by engaging in certain behaviors, ideally by learning certain things. A lot of what we're doing, this cognitive part, is learning stuff, this self-awareness. And then doing that, it's like, I think since this has been working, I'll keep doing it. But what often happens is people come into AA and life gets better. Whether they're working the steps or not, they stop drinking for a while, and so they start showing up where they're supposed to, and they're no longer breaking laws so they don't get arrested and this and that. And then after a year or two, when they've gotten the boyfriend or the girlfriend back and the job, it's like, I am really glad that AA, NA, OA is there for those poor slobs who are really troubled. AA was really helpful to me, but I wasn't that bad. And they drift away. And they drift away because things have gotten better rather than because things have gotten worse. And it's very common. And a lot of people, I think they go on to have fine, happy lives, but a lot of people slide into a place that is not very comfortable. And they start getting therapists here that have seen their clients go on antidepressants. Quite often you can see the change in the client before they do. And people go into recovery. The people around them will often see the change that's going on in them before they notice it themselves. And it's the same thing going in the other direction. You seem a little edgy today. No, I'm good. What are you so angry about? I'm not angry. Fuck you. I'm fine. And what's going on is they're losing their emotional or their spiritual balance. And they desperately don't want to lose it, and so they're able to be in denial about it. And a lot of people relapse as a result. And one of the classic lines you'll hear in AA is, whenever somebody relapses and they come back, I ask them, how come, what happened? How come you relapsed? He said, well, first I stopped going to meetings. Now, I don't really particularly think that everybody needs to go to 12-step programs forever. Some people do. And for other people, they're able to have happy, enjoyable lives without continuing on with that thing. But there's a lot of other people that they're able to stay out of trouble and they're able to keep a job, but they slide back into what's called a dry drunk. They're what they call cranky, irritable, and discontented. And it's not a wonderful place to hang out. So the idea of this recovery thing is getting to a point where you're comfortable in your own skin, and then figuring out for you as an individual, what do you need to do to maintain that? And what one person needs to do is different from what another person needs to do. And I'm not trying to sell the idea that everybody needs to go to 3 AA meetings for 40 years. Some people will simply because they like it. Some people will because they feel like they need it. Some people will do it because they don't have anything else to do. And a lot of people that don't do it will be because they were encouraged by family members or therapists to stop, which I sort of think is like encouraging a person to stop exercising or stop meditating. It's like, well, you could, but you know, if it's being beneficial, why don't you keep doing it? So altruistic defense, spiritual awakening. And what you'll see if you work with people who are actively getting into recovery, what you'll see is you'll see their eyes come alive. You'll see them start to relax. And you know, occasionally you'll hear them, they'll come in and say, you know, I was walking down the street today and I heard a bird. I smelled the grass as it was being mowed. That's the sign of someone who is becoming present, at least momentarily. And it's pretty awesome. That's the 12th step. Slogans as CBT tools. One day at a time. That's code for be here now. And very powerful, seems really stupid. A lot of people when they're going into AA, they don't like all the cutesy things and the slogans on the walls. But you know, as someone that is a meditator, you know, the concept of being present is profoundly important. And as someone that has, you know, observed people and watched them suffering the pain of this thing that's going to go wrong next week, and helping them learn how to become competent to only suffer that pain if that thing actually happens. Sort of like the idea of fighting 99 fights in anticipation of the one real one. You know, the person's all worn out from all the ones they had in their head, and they don't do as well in the real one. Easy does it, but do it. The sign on the wall says easy does it. 12-step members generally add, or quite often add, the concept, but do it, because one can unintentionally encourage people to sort of sit on their duff. Sort of the classic thing I mentioned earlier is, my God wanted me to be sober, you know, I'd be sober. You know, if God wanted my dishes to be done, you know, they'd be done. So it's like, easy does it, but do it. Don't stress yourself out, but take the actions you need to do to take care of yourself. There, but for the grace of God go I. Who's ever seen somebody on the commons begging and had a thought disparaging of the person on the commons? Yeah. There, but for the grace of God go I. It's a real handy thing to hold on to. One of the things you'll find from people that have really blown it in their lives is many of them are inclined to be less judgmental of others, because they have had the gift of desperation. They've had the embarrassment of seeing their name in the paper, or flunking out of school, or losing the job, or the relationship, or that sort of thing. And unlike people that, you know, have either truly kept it all together, they don't come into my office, so I'm sure there are some, but I don't know them. Or the ones that have been able to maintain the appearance of having everything together, and there's a lot more of those. And it's really easy to be judgmental of those people. Clearly, you know, they're lazy. You know, they're on drugs. You know, there's a few people begging on the commons right now that you know, I happen to know they're not using. You know, they're clean. and they're trying hard and they're helping other people. And a fair amount of time, some of the money they're getting begging, they're giving away. But that's not the first thought that would come to us, when we see them. So yeah, there but for the grace of God go I, letting go of judgment and being grateful. I mentioned earlier about the benefits of doing written gratitude lists. One of the things you'll hear in the 12-step rooms is a grateful alcoholic will not drink again. A grateful drug addict will not use. And I don't know that's universally true, but it is my experience that if people are able to experience gratitude, they're less inclined to go into that negative space of, if this is all there is, I might as well use. Or if you had my life, you'd use too. And what's going on for most of us is we don't notice the good stuff. When I tell people or recommend to people to do gratitude lists, I generally tell them, I say, put 10 things on the list every day and you don't get to repeat anything till you get to 100. And they look at me like I'm insane, which actually is a separate issue. And they quite often can't. I've had people say, I can't come up with 3. I can't come up with 3 things to be grateful for. And they can't. And that's because we are so habituated to all the good stuff in our life, we don't notice it. That middle one, bring your life into your conscious awareness, that's profoundly important. How many people this morning when they cleaned up or took a shower experienced gratitude for having hot water? Okay, there's a couple. There's a couple. How many are grateful that they had toothpaste? I mean, this looks great. How many are grateful that other people brush their teeth? How many are grateful? It wasn't that long ago that if you were walking down a street in a city like Ithaca, have you ever heard of the term toss pot? Or chamber pot? Yeah. Okay, yeah. You could be walking down the street and a pot of, our excrement can come flying out the window and hit you. That doesn't happen anymore around here. People aren't grateful for that. There's a lot of stuff to be grateful for. This would hit home for more people. How many people are grateful that they have clean clothes? The people that we were referencing on the Commons don't have the luxury of having clean clothes. So it's profoundly important to expend energy to work on developing the ability to experience gratitude in ways that most people aren't inclined to do. Just like the marathon runner needs to develop the capacities. To do that, they have to develop the skills and the competencies. In all likelihood for that to happen, they have to have healthy discipline, and you're sort of getting stuck with the knowledge today. That's sort of happening. Live and let live. Once again, letting go of judgment. There's an AA group in Ithaca called the Live and Let Live group, which is for gay and lesbian people. It's been active in Ithaca for at least 30 years. And it's a really good attitude for people to have, both the people that are participants in the group and also for the people that are not members of that group to say, oh yeah, cool, it's good that's happening. And also for the people who are members of that group to not be judgmental of the other people who are not members of that group. So it goes both ways. These are some that I just sort of picked up. Faith moves mountains, but bring a shovel. If you were to be sitting around talking with some people in early recovery, you'll hear people talking about how hard things are. And they're depressed, and they're anxious, and they talk about sitting in a dumpy apartment, and the sink is full of dishes, and the bed's not made. And it's like, well, go do the dishes. Make your bed. I tell people, if you want to get sober, make your bed every day and park legally. 2 very important aspects of getting sober is, one, taking personal responsibility. It is my job to take care of myself. It is my job to take care of my clothes, to take care of my living environment. And the interesting thing is, people will start doing it, and they have a clean kitchen, if they have a kitchen. What you'll often hear, and I literally have known this from people I've worked with, is that they start out, they're living in the shelter, and they're going to meetings, and they're getting better, not necessarily noticing. And you see them, and they're complaining about living in the shelter. You see them 10 years later, they have their own house, and they're complaining of the taxes. Their life has gotten a lot better, but they haven't really experienced it, because they're still living in what they don't have or what's not right. What you want to have is a person to be able to experience. And what will happen, people start doing their dishes, they start making their bed, they start feeling better about themselves. Their depression diminishes. Their anxiety diminishes. They start parking legally. They stop thinking they're better than everybody else and the rules don't apply to them, and they let go of the anxiety about getting a ticket. Two very good things, but taking that personal responsibility, even in small increments, is incredibly important for people to continue to move in the right direction. Well, I guess I have that stuff right there, don't I? And trust God, but lock your bike. That is an excellent one, and it's true, because once again, what we're doing is becoming more competent at seeing what's what. And it's pretty, there's a thing called pink clouds in recovery. And people in early recovery, and everything has gone from absolutely terrible to absolutely wonderful. And that often is things aren't quite as rosy as they may feel. And it's really important to help people stay on track, and have them keep doing what they need to do to continue to grow. But basically, those are people that won't lock their bike because they're hanging out with all these recovering people, but one or two of those people isn't quite as in recovery as the others, and the bike disappears, and it's very disheartening. So trust God, lock your bike. Right? HALT. How many people have heard of HALT? Hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. So people that are drinking alcoholically, people that are consuming other drugs, often cannot tell the difference between being hungry and being anxious. They don't know. A lot of people, when they get into recovery, are not in the habit of having healthy diets. They're not in the habit of being able to identify when they're angry. They don't recognize when they're lonely. They don't know anything about this concept of an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. They don't know the concept of isolation. They just know everybody's an asshole. That's all they know. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And the idea is, it's very simple, is you don't want to become too hungry, too angry, too lonely, too tired for too long, because you have a high probability of using if you do. And if you combine those, and you're in school, you're not getting enough sleep, you're not eating right, you have the stress of exams, plus trying to fit in and have a social life. It really increases the risk of somebody walks by with a joint, or somebody says, come on, we're having a couple of beers down here, just have one. It really increases the odds of that happening. And they have no idea that's happening because it's not in their consciousness that it really is a good idea to eat something a few times a day. And it's really a good idea to develop the ability to tell the difference between being angry and the other emotions that we can have. So we have a few acronyms for fear. The first one is probably the most popular. Second one is the flip side of that, face everything and recover, and a false evidence appearing real. Now we'll go back to my bus metaphor, false evidence. You see the billboard picture of the bus, and you have that emotional response, and you're wrong. You're misinterpreting incoming data, but you don't know it. So you start doing what they talk about with take a couple of deep breaths, relax, keep your mouth shut, and, oh, okay, I don't need to be afraid, I'm okay. Now this could be the end of our session, but we're going to have time, so we can talk about the traditions also. But this is my favorite thing about AA. These are called the promises. It's just a couple of paragraphs that are in what they call the big book. And they were not intended when written to be something that's sort of split out from the rest of the book and quoted ad nauseum forever. They're just a couple of really powerful paragraphs that Bill wrote when he was writing the original book in 39. And as a therapist, and actually as a mostly Buddhist, they're profoundly insightful to me from both veins, and really speak to something that I think happens for a lot of people in recovery and is totally foreign and impossible to anybody the day before they go to rehab, or the day before they get into the therapist's office, or the day before they go into their first meeting. And quite honestly, it seems pretty unlikely for people even that have been around for a while. But I've seen these things happen for many people that I've worked with and others that I know, and it's pretty powerful. If we are pain, oh, and they say that these promises, they say they come through halfway through the 9th step. So halfway through going around and making amends to the people that you lied to or you stole from or you disappointed in one way or another. They say these come true. I have seen a lot of people experience these promises well before they ever did a 9th step. I have seen other people be in AA for years and not experience them. But a whole lot of people do, and I think it can be worthwhile for a therapist, if you're working with people who are in recovery, to familiarize yourself with these 2 pages or 2 paragraphs and talk with people about the implications of what's said here and the fact that it may be possible for them to experience it. If we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we'll be amazed before we are halfway through. We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. Now that's a hell of a promise. Freedom and happiness. It goes back to what you were mentioning, Tommy. We will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. Now that is quite the promise for those people who have been in jail, who have lost their families, who behaved in ways of which they sincerely disapprove. They'll neither regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. And there's a huge difference between not regretting the past and not wanting to shut the door on it, and having the past jammed down in that bucket of repression, suppression, and denial. And so it's qualitatively profoundly different, and it is possible. We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. Pretty awesome. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. Now, there's very interesting implications to that line. And no matter how far down the scale we've gone, we'll see how our experience can benefit others. Implicit in that is a lot of the good that is listed in this paragraph comes about as a result of taking one's own disappointments, bad behaviors, bad outcomes, and using them to help others who are in that situation. And you see this happen all the time in a 12-step environment. A new woman comes in and she's going through an ugly divorce, and she's being accused of being a bad drunk, and so the kids are being taken away. And all of a sudden there's 3 women around her who are accused of the same thing, and in fact they were guilty of the same thing. And they've worked through it. And they have decent relationships with their kids, or they've gotten through the legal stuff, and they're able to help that person do it, and then that person in turn does that for the next one that comes. There's that low self-esteem and compensatory arrogance. As you're helping others, the low self, I can't believe I did that to my kids. It heals. And self-forgiveness, another thing you're bringing up, Tommy. The self-forgiveness comes in.
This reminds me of Viktor Frankl's logotherapy.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Although I pass meaning.
Important. And it's an incredible gift that one has to work for. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Now that would go back to the St. Francis prayer. And what happens is when you make that change of trying to understand rather than be understood and love rather than be loved, you feel better. It's not necessarily that you become all virtuous and wonderful, but you feel better. And as you feel better without alcohol and drugs, you have a higher probability of not relapsing. Self-seeking will slip away. Same idea. Our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Here's a biggie. Fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. And I'm saying that, addiction is driven by self-centered fear. And here's a promise that the fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. It's important to note it doesn't say economic insecurity will leave us. It says fear of economic insecurity will leave us, and that's an important distinction, because just because you get sober doesn't mean you get a good job or you get money in your bank. But the fact that you don't have it is not as crippling anymore, usually. We will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. Now, who would like to have that ability? Yeah. We'll intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. Now, the way I think about this, how does this come about? Well, one of the things that I said a bit earlier was I don't want your fearful, angry self to make your decisions or control your behaviors. I want your centered, balanced self to make your decisions and control your behaviors. A lot of what we've been talking about increases our ability to be centered and balanced. When we're centered and balanced, we have the highest probability of figuring stuff out. Whether all we're figuring out is I need to call a lawyer, or I need to call a doctor, or or I need to talk to my friends, or I need to take this action. What we need to do, they talk about, and again I was talking about this at lunch, that quiet inner voice. A lot of people would consider that quiet inner voice as the higher power. Now, our fearful, whatever that little voice is when we're scared and angry, that's not our quiet inner voice. But our centered, balanced self has access to, and basically what intuition is, and when I was in the business school, they talked about, I had a book on heuristics. And heuristics is a very expensive word that just means intuition that's informed by experience. And a lot of us can make good decisions based on intuition, based on informed awareness as it's coming from our centered self, including if that's simply the advice, the internal advice of don't do anything because you're clueless. We're able to hear that rather than do something impulsively because our anxiety forces us to. We'll intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. We'll suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. When I'm reading this to clients, I'll sometimes leave that line out because it doesn't exactly fit with the language that I like to use. But then again, it could be exactly what's happening. Who am I to say? It doesn't detract from the overall promises as far as I'm concerned. Are these extravagant promises? We think not. They're being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. They will always materialize if we work for them. That's a pretty big promise. I'm not so sure that it always happens, but it happens a lot for a lot of people. And that's pretty cool. So that is the meat of most of what I wanted to talk about. I do have a couple more slides, though we do have time. But let's take a pause for about 5 minutes, and if you need to go to the restroom, do, or get a drink, and then we'll talk about their traditions for a few minutes. Okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about the traditions of AA. When I start talking about the traditions, I always feel a little guilty because they don't get as much attention from me as the steps. But basically that's the way it goes in AA too, and in NA. People don't quite spend as much time focusing on their traditions as the steps, and that actually makes sense because they aren't quite as integral to the day-to-day recovery of the individuals. They're more important for the sustaining of the ongoing viability of the 12-step programs themselves. So it doesn't take quite as much attention. But I think it can be really helpful for people who are in the professional field to get to know a little bit more about the workings of 12-step stuff, because there's so many cults and there's so many things that started out well, and then, you know, there's somebody living in mansions, flying helicopters and having a dozen Rolls Royces and stuff. And I think it would be reasonable people be wondering if that's happening in the 12-step stuff. And the 12 traditions really came about as an effort to keep that from happening. And they mostly came about through trial and error. There was one AA group in the Midwest that had a whole lot of rules of what the requirements for membership, basically. And you know, you had to be this and you couldn't be that, and you had to be willing to do this and you couldn't do that, and this and that. And somebody took account of all the various rules that different people in that group had, and they came up with 61 rules for the requirements to be able to be a member of a 12-step program. And was this open for air or just open? I'm going to close it down. And so this gentleman, the member of the group, came up with Rule 62. And Rule 62 is don't take yourself so seriously. And it was a real good idea. They realized that none of them would have been allowed to be members of the meeting if all those rules had been in place. And like that Rule 62, the traditions came about. It really is a result of the pitfalls in the growing pains that AA suffered in its first 10 years. The traditions were developed in the late 40s, and Bill Wilson had to travel the country to try and sell them to the various AA groups that had developed by that time. And there was a lot of controversy about it. A lot of people wanted to do things exactly they were doing it, and they were fine just with the steps, thank you very much. There were a number of groups through the 50s and the 60s that wouldn't sort of acknowledge or adhere to the traditions. They were in fact voted in at an international convention in the early 50s. And at that time, there was also a change in the governance of AA. AA had been governed by the trustees of Alcoholics Anonymous, which at the beginning had a non-alcoholic majority. And they had decided on a non-alcoholic majority just so that people wouldn't get drunk and take the money and screw everything up. At that time in the early 50s, AA was, so this must have been it was about 52. There's a book, one of the AA history books is called AA Comes of Age, and it was about the first 20 years of its existence. And at that time, they voted in the traditions. They sort of elected or told Bill that he was sort of like the founder and emeritus, and he no longer had any governing things. And the Board of Trustees ended up with an alcoholic majority, and that was sort of when AA traditionally has regarded them of coming of age and coming into its own. So it was through that trial and error that these traditions came up. They can be controversial in the rooms, and I think that they can give people pause or, not really understand what that they can be about. So one is our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. My understanding of that tradition is that AA members have an obligation when they disagree to disagree respectfully, rather than AA members must agree on everything. You can find AA meetings and AA members who say, no, you can't, we don't talk about pot. We don't talk about this thing, you can't have this or that. That's not the intention. The intention is that if you and I aren't seeing things eye to eye, I'm going to be courteous and respectful to you, and you'll be courteous and respectful to me. They actually have a concept in AA called the minority opinion. And so it is a really well-functioning democracy, and that, the way you get drafted for a job is you fail to show up at a meeting and the person that's not there gets the job, because they're not there to decline it. So it's not, people don't campaign for things and this and that. And people rotate into and out of positions. There are some, there's like, the local general service rep, and there's local meetings, and there's regional, and there's state, and there's up to international. But nobody stays and builds a little empire in what they're doing. Almost nobody. So it's very democratic that way. But the idea as a first tradition is everybody treats each other respectfully, whether they agree or not. For our group purpose, there is one ultimate authority, a loving God, as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. So this is the only tradition that God is mentioned in, so it's a little less intense than the steps. It is written in a parochial fashion with the pronouns. A lot of times people will say, for our group purpose, but one ultimate authority, a loving God is maybe expressed in our group conscience. And then the old-timers yell at them. But they do it respectfully, so it works out okay. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. AA, for some reason, has been pretty good about adhering to that and about being able to listen to people. Change in AA is glacial. For years they've talked about changing some of the wording of this, that, or the other thing, and it generally doesn't happen because it's like, don't mess with it. But people are pretty good about not being ego-driven and accumulating power or authority in the organization. The only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. That is the one tradition that the wording has been changed in. The original wording of that tradition was the only requirement for AA membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. And they took the word honest out because most people that were there realized that they did not have an honest desire to quit drinking. They had an honest desire to be out of trouble. And so they actually deleted the word honest because it felt more honest to do so. And that, that is very important. And if this fits in, about sending potheads or opiate addicts to AA, AA has open meetings and closed meetings. Anyone's welcome at open meetings. They have meeting lists locally, online, and in paper, and they have little keys so you can tell which ones are open and which are closed. Anybody is welcome at open meetings. The distinction was created back in the early days so that people from the press and people from schools and doctors and things like that could come to meetings. But they wanted closed meetings so that there wouldn't be anybody breaking the anonymity of people and ruining their careers and things like that. I don't have a problem sending my clients to their issue is drugs or other than alcohol. I don't have a problem sending them to closed meetings, but I do counsel them about being respectful of their traditions. And I'm probably not being totally kosher when I do that. But I don't care. I think it's really important for people. It's more important for me for people to be in recovery and to interact with people that are working with these principles and these ideas than it is to honor a concept that I think very likely wasn't fully well dealt with back in the 60s when I think people got a tad more militant about these things. I think mostly because culturally they didn't like the people that were the way they looked and behaved, that were smoking a lot of pot and they're coming from San Francisco and here down to here. And I think historically that was a lot of what was going on. That's how I rationalize it. and I may change my mind on that someday. And if I do, I'll tell the group I'm talking to that I changed my mind on it. So, yeah.
Is there any room in meetings to talk about people's, what word do I want to use, inability or unwillingness to believe in God or relate to God? Or
Oh, yeah.
atheism?
There's on Thursday nights, there's the,
This is a really strong statement, God's statement here. Many of them want that.
oh yeah, it is, there's, on Thursday night, there's the Free Thinkers meeting, and they are very atheistic and adamant about it and sort of bomb throwers about it. Very popular meeting. I'd send people to that if it's a big thing. I also, as I told Evie earlier, there's a guy named Stephen Levine who got sober in AA, and he's a Buddhist. His parents were very famous. Did I say Stephen? I meant Noah is the one that's doing the Refuge Recovery. Thank you. And his dad and mom both were famous writers. Stephen Levine being one. And he's doing a great job with recovery. It really comes out of this tradition, but he's changed the language and some of the concept. I love the. I actually do a retreat based on the 12 steps from a Buddhist perspective, and so I like that. But it is different. But the Free Thinkers on Thursday nights locally. Yeah.
A quick thing about the singleness purpose and the third step, another rationalization that I use with clients, and just in general is, you know, if you go to an AA meeting and you say, I had a really bad day and I coped by shoplifting and sleeping with 10 people, but I didn't drink, that's kind of okay. But if you go in and say, I had a really bad day and I coped by doing a bunch of cocaine, but I didn't drink, that's not okay. You know what I mean? And so that is, I think, the difference in why you're still welcome and you can still get help in AA even if you're also struggling with drug addiction.
Yeah, and I think that's well put. And what a lot of people do over time is say, you know, I'm not using, but I'm still engaging in insane behaviors and it's causing me to suffer a lot. And I need help, I need support. And that everybody relates to. Because when people quit drinking or quit doing drugs, they don't normally get all like blissed out and behave well quickly. Each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. You know, this still is in effect and leads to a lot of different personalities and groups. I think it would have been very difficult for me if I had to get sober in Kansas or Alabama or something. It probably would have been tough if with the militant, you have to believe in Jesus to, and I heard that said once, you have to believe in Jesus to, to get sober. It's like, not for me. But they get to do it. And like I said, there is a lot of love and compassion in AA, and people being problematic is really more the exception than the rule. And so I take everything when I say something negative, take it with a grain of salt. The preponderance is positive. But that also has helped people to grow and to shift and become and stay more accepting than if it was all delivered down from on high. Each group has but one primary purpose: to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. People in recovery are very aware that there's a lot of people in 12-step rooms. They've been al-anon members for a long time. They've been OA members for a long time, AA members, NA members for a long time, and they're sitting in the room and they're suffering. And so there's a tradition of being aware of taking care not just of the newcomer, but the person that's been sitting next to you for 10 years or 5 years or whatever, and that it's an ongoing process that is really important. And, and also that the carrying the message, the group's purpose is not to acquire a lot of money or to become the biggest group or the most important group in the sense, it's to help other people. And so it sort of focuses attention. An AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. As I mentioned, the early AA members, they wanted to build hospitals and this and that, and they were dissuaded from that, and it's been a very good decision. There are a lot of AA clubhouses. There is one in Ithaca at 518 West Seneca Street. A group of people got together, some in recovery, some not. They started a 501c3. They raised some money, bought the building, and it's called Ithaca Community Recovery. It is not affiliated with AA, but what they do is they rent out space to recovering groups. And there's an incredible number of groups that meet there every day and every week. And that facilitates meetings to happen. But all of the groups that meet there pay rent. When the groups, they don't own buildings, so AA groups have met in churches and in schools and government buildings and hospitals forever. And wherever they meet, they pay rent, even if it's only a token, basically so they're not beholden to anybody. And so they don't have to worry about being influenced by somebody else. But the people that own and operate these things are totally separate. AA is not affiliated with any rehabs anywhere or any hospitals or any professionals. And that is by design and the traditions, and I think it's really helped the whole thing keep going well. Every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. There was an organization in the 1830s and 40s called the Washingtonians. And the Washingtonians were very much like AA. They led a lot of people to quit drinking, hundreds of thousands. But then they got involved in political stuff and the anti-slavery movement, this and that. It fell apart in a matter of a year or two. And AA early members learn from that, and so they're not influenced. They don't accept money from liquor companies or therapist groups or the APA or the AMA or anybody else, or rich and successful people. AA is pretty much survives on the money from selling its literature and from donations from groups like in Ithaca. Groups will often, 60% of basically they'll pass a hat at every meeting. Everybody will put in $1. That'll pay for coffee, literature, pamphlets, and rent, and these days insurance, because they have to have a liability insurance in most places. So 60% of what they raise will go there, 30% will go to the local intergroup, and 10% will go down to New York City to the international office, and that's sort of how it works. The international office, all it keeps is what's called, they regard as a prudent reserve, and that's either $1 or $2 for every member. So if the census is that there's 2 million people in AA, AA's international committee would limit money they would keep to $4 million, which for an organization with millions of members, that's not that much these days. And they do it consciously, so it doesn't screw things up. Should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. The special workers are often people that run the offices, buy the books, put on conventions and things like that. A lot of people in AA travel down to the headquarters in New York City. It's sort of like Mecca. There's a couple of Meccas. There's the headquarters in New York, and there's the Wilson House in Vermont where Bill Wilson was born, and Stepping Stones where he lived when he died, and Dr. Bob's house in Akron where AA got started. So the people that are really into it will do that loop, and they're very popular.
Do they have conferences?
Well, I would. The retreat that I do is at the Wilson House in Vermont every year on the 12 Steps from a Buddhist Perspective. So groups come. There's some big AA groups out of New York and Boston that'll rent or have a retreat there for the weekend at the Wilson House. Stepping Stones is much more limited because of zoning things, and Dr. Bob's is just small, so it's mostly people stopping in and seeing the original coffee pot, and getting filled up. So no professionals in AA, which has its good points and its bad points. Some of the questions about sponsorship, well, there's no professionals, so there really isn't any school for training people, but on average it works pretty well. AA as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. Once again, that's an effort to not set up a situation where there are going to be little fiefdoms or power structures or people becoming entrenched in various things, and it seems to have worked really quite well so far. Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. Originally, this came back from what happened with the Washingtonians, and back in the 30s, actually, liquor companies did come and try and sponsor things, sort of like, we're the healthy booze sort of thing, or, you endorse this and that. And AA had the sense to not get involved in that. There are many other controversies that could come up. One that came up probably 20 years ago now, there's an organization called Secular Organization for Sobriety. And a few years after that, there was one called Moderation Management. Moderation Management is very popular among alcoholics because it helps you learn how to drink responsibly. And it's a really sad story, the woman that wrote the book and started it, and is still active, and it is helpful for some people. She was on Oprah, she did the whole thing, and then she unfortunately killed 2 people drunk driving. And she was very apologetic. She felt, I was alcoholic. I've been alcoholic, and I was in denial. So it's very hard to prove a negative. So she was witness to that, and really unfortunate for her. She seemed like a lovely person. But AA doesn't talk when the newspaper calls up. What do you think about secular organizations? We have no opinion. And it's not to try and hide, it's try to avoid becoming embroiled in controversy. Individual AA members have all sorts of opinions, many very strongly held, and even once or twice well informed. Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need to always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. Sort of self-explanatory. These days they want to change that, press, radio, films, internet, and that'll probably take another 20 years to change. Television. It's very interesting when you hear people talk about anonymity. The original intention was to protect people's reputations and things like that. But then early on, there was a baseball player that got sober in AA, went on the news and extolled the virtues of AA and how wonderful it was. Then he got drunk, which proved to everybody how AA doesn't work. And there was a lot of controversy with Bill and Bob's, who were touring all over, and Marty Mann, as she toured all over. How do we handle this? And basically, it was always handled with the first names and initials only. And interestingly, ultimately, they came to realize how important it was remember that humility quote, the 7th step? How important it was for right-sizeness, for people to not get all puffed up, and how wonderful I am that I am this spiritual person living this wonderful life. And that's really not healthy for people. It's not healthy for addicts and alcoholics to do that. Bill had a very large ego, so his way of being in the world really encouraged them to get there with this one, and he adhered to it. And his last name really didn't get used in the press till he passed away. And I think it's a good thing now. There is controversy. There are now groups that, as a matter of fact, Judge Raleigh is one that talks about people in recovery and people that are in recovery becoming more outspoken about it and more published about it to help the movement of getting people into recovery. So there's some of that happening, and I think that it has its pluses and minuses, and and good for everybody as they try and do the best they can to help people. And finally, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. That last little bit that I was saying about the ego thing, that fits in with this one rather than the prior. But it's really interesting. The fact is that me as an individual, as a therapist, as a, you know, a father and a husband and this and that, I will screw up. I will make mistakes. I will let people down. The same is true for individuals in 12-step programs. As individuals, they screw up. I mean, you know, not even to think about all the mental health issues and the, you know, and the poor upbringing and the bad behaviors involved with it. But people are fallible. People are imperfect. But the principles are really pretty well grounded. And so it's I think, a very worthwhile thing as we hear about some guy, and it's usually a guy hitting on some newcomer woman in recovery. In Ithaca, it can sort of go both ways because we're pretty flexible here in Ithaca. But you know, that is something that's frowned on in AA. It's called 13th stepping. That's when somebody with time hits on a newcomer. It's frowned on. It's bad for the individuals and it's bad for AA because it makes it look like an unsafe environment. But stuff does happen, and the thing is, though, is the principle is don't do that. And there are other people around us, when they see it happening, will say, don't do that. What you're doing isn't okay. Stop it. And people will rally around to try and once again make something that became unsafe safe again, or to keep it from happening. So the principles of the 12-step stuff are very helpful and very positive and very solid. The humans involved are fallible, and that's a good thing to keep in mind when somebody's a jerk. And, you know, and to realize that's an individual being a jerk rather than condemn the whole effort. Sort of like with us therapists, you know, we're all fallible. You know, on the whole, it's a good idea to have therapists, and you know, we do a lot of help, but we're not perfect at that. So that, I think, is about as far as I went. It is. And that works out just about right. It's about 5:04. Does anybody have any thoughts, concerns, questions, comments?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate your being here and paying such good attention. It's a lot of fun. Thanks. Yeah, Jerry.
Evaluations, right?
Yeah, they do want evaluations. Yeah, Jerry.
Just if you would address boundary issues when it comes to therapists attending open meetings, or therapists who are in recovery encountering clients who they may have not been aware were deciding to go into AA, for instance, or even in a situation where you've gone to meetings and then you have a person contact you for an intake, we'll call it,
Okay.
and then that person arrives and you both recognize one another from a meeting.
I haven't been totally clear and candid about this, but I think that question sort of forces me to. I've been in recovery for many years. I go to meetings in AA. I have a lot of clients in meetings in AA and NA and other A's around town. And it's generally not a problem for me. The only time I've ever had a problem, I was stalked by one woman who was never a client of mine, and it was very uncomfortable and very difficult for everyone, but I've never had difficulty with a client. But Jerry's question about boundaries is really important. As a therapist, there are times when I avoid certain meetings because I know that somebody may be going there that is uncertain or embarrassed or awkward, and I want to give them the space so that they can do what they need to do. I don't need to go to a particular meeting or I'm going to drink. That's long not been a problem. So I do try and pay attention to that. I regard my involvement in recovery as being good modeling. I have an awesome life. I have good relationships, and I still participate. That I think is good modeling for people that get there. I also try and, as they say, that the end of the 12th step is practice these principles in all my affairs, and people get to witness that, and so it's not a bad thing. If I were to, and I have had people that didn't realize I was in recovery try and set up an appointments. Sometimes I let them know early on that I'm in recovery. Quite often I don't. and I do it on an individual basis, depending on what seems to be most therapeutic thing to do based on that particular individual and that particular set of circumstances. Sometimes I'll tell people first session, sometimes people come and go, and it's never been brought up by me. And quite honestly, my name also is a rather unique name, a unique first name, so a lot of people know one way or the other. As far as therapists, and you go to the Wednesday night open meeting to find out a little bit about AA, and you find that you have a client there, I would suggest that your next session with that client, you talk about it. And I would suggest that, how do I handle it during that meeting or after that meeting when we make eye contact? I'd let the client have the lead. If the client were making some sort of entree visually or verbally that they wanted to relate with me, I would be open to that. And if they were sort of ducking away from me, I'd give them their space and I wouldn't worry about it. Now, that doesn't mean that someone wouldn't blame me for never going back to a Just because I get blamed doesn't mean it's true. And I actually believe that. And also, there could be a time when they blame me for that, and they go through their particular path for the next 6 months or year, and all of a sudden I get a call and they're saying, I'd like you to be my therapist, and I hated you for 11 and a half months. It happens, and it's all okay. So basically, you do the same thing that any visitor to a 12-step meeting does, is you make it a point to respect the anonymity of people and to not repeat what's said. I guess one final thing of that, I do have people sometimes want to tell me stuff about somebody else. They've gotten wind that somebody is my client, and so they want to tell me something they're up to. They're in relapse. If they tell me stuff that I wouldn't otherwise be hearing, I can't work with it. So I keep it to myself in the sessions with the client. Generally, if I have a client or a friend, for that matter, that's in relapse, I don't need to dive in to try and find out, because it's going to become evident. Addicts and alcoholics, when they're in relapse, they will at some point make it obvious. Ideally, I can help people stay alive by the sooner I find out, but it's more important for me to protect people's confidentiality and their feeling of safety than it is to have my ego go, I don't want you to think that you're getting over on me by acting like you didn't relapse. That's just my ego wanting to be important and a really brilliant therapist. I don't need to be brilliant, important and a brilliant therapist. I just try and sort of muddle through with that as best I can and keep my center when that sort of thing is going on. And one final thing with that, I also have had people come up and say, so-and-so is really suicidal. And then I will hunt the person down. And I probably have had, over the years, probably a half a dozen times, I've called 911 and had them put into 2 North. I had one guy recently, I called 911 3 times in one day. Actually, I called twice, somebody else called the third time, and he finally was in 2 North the third time. And he's safely in rehab, and he's doing well. But I do what makes sense to me at the time, and just like I've talked, the first thing I try and do is realize what's going on for me emotionally, get back to center, and have my centered and balanced self say, what do I need to do in this situation? And that usually, works pretty well. Thanks, Jerry, for bringing that one up. Anything else? Thank you very much.